here, or where might we be making assumptions, and then where are there tensions or trade-offs? Let me just open it up to the group. What do we mean when we talk about shared safety for our community?
I can try. um, from my perspective, and within that framework of shared safety, it's really everyone taking accountability for making sure that the people who are most harmed in our community are the best served. Right now, it's kind of the opposite, right? We have people who are the most harmed are often the least served in Evanston, even though we're well resourced as a community, even though our levels of crime are lower than most communities, we still fail in many ways to support and actually shape our safety around community well-being, community health framework. So in that lens, right, we're putting resources in places that don't actually make our community well. So for me, shared safety is really looking at how do we make our community well, because a well community is often a safe community for all, not just some.
At the risk of putting you on the spot, can you say a little more about what you mean by making our community well?
I think we don't often talk about trauma and trauma recovery and the need to do that. So we talk about violence prevention a lot, but we stop right at that conversation. We don't often take it far enough to actually expand on, once somebody is harmed, how do we make sure that they don't continue the cycle of harm, right? How do we make sure that they're supported and have trauma recovery services community that are accessible and affordable? We just don't. I mean, we learned this through our alternative community committee, where we don't even have, we have all these great nonprofits, but we don't even have like this coordinated approach to plugging people in and in time of crisis to all the services in our community. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're actually talking about trauma as a community piece, right? Because sometimes we talk about it as survivors are the only ones who are traumatized, but we know that neighbors are traumatized when there's issues of safety. We know that schools, teachers, right? Service providers are all facing trauma as well. So just looking at that and making sure that we're actually addressing trauma as we seek to create safer spaces in our community and break the cycle of harm.
Great, thank you. And so I heard a number of items in there that are really critical. The beginning, the first thing you said, I think bears repeating, which is centering the needs of those who are most harmed in our efforts to provide safety. And the other is this public health trauma recovery vision of what safety is about and is for. Thank you. I think Sarah was next.
I had my hand up. Also, sorry I'm not on camera, but I am here. But Evangeline covered it. I agree with everything you just said, and I'm on the same page as that. So I would be redundant to say my piece.
Thank you. Alejandra.
You muted. All right, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
That's
Okay.
better. Yep.
Thank you. As we reimagine public safety, I try to put myself, it's kind of hard when we've thought about public safety in such what's normal for public safety in our minds, I think, is thinking about policing and punishment. So trying to think outside of that box. Really, I think about, to what Evangeline was saying, like that everyone has what they need, right? That everyone in Evanston, everyone in our society has access to healthcare, to good jobs, to housing, to education, even good food. And so for me, those are the basic things. And sometimes maybe we don't think about those things as safety, but if everyone has what they need, then they don't need to then do things that bring them harm because all their basic needs have been met, right? So again, back to the basics, everyone has access to a good job, not just any job, but a good paying job, right? Everyone has access to healthcare, so their mental and physical health needs are being met. Folks feel welcomed. And so, when they can speak about their home or their hometown, and it's a place that meets all their needs. So I think that to me is kind of, for me, a reimagined public safety.
Thank you. And I'm going to sort of interject just because I think I'm trying to both educate myself, but also maybe use myself as a reflector as to gauge whether the group is understanding one another. And so feel free to jump back in, Alejandro, if what I say now is a poor rendering of what's on your mind. But part of what I'm hearing is safety is kind of downstream of security in the sense of economic and social security.
Yes.
Right. That if you're economically secure, materially speaking, and you're socially secure, that you're welcome and accepted and valued in the place where you live, then from that arises the tools to provide for safety. Is that a fair rendering?
I love that. Yeah.
Thank you. Andy.
So let me just say, I agree with everything that was already said, and I really appreciate bringing it to this sort of those core levels and the values that are inherent in them. I actually just want to say, kind of on the record too, is at the base level of feeling safe and actually being safe in public spaces, schools, beaches, stores, your home, being free from the threat or the perceived threat is really key, right? So if people don't feel safe, they're not going to act safe, and they're going to potentially, it's going to stress themselves out. Being free from surveillance is essential, but feeling safe and then adding the public side in there is a very base level. I actually feel, and just to answer a little bit of your second question, that most people agree that that is like a minimum standard of what we mean, feeling safe in those spaces. And just to add a point of tension, someone brought it up in the last meeting. I apologize. I don't know who did it. The tension is going to come about what people think makes them safe in those spaces, especially when they don't feel safe. So people carry firearms when they don't feel safe. That makes other people unsafe. And that's a really important tension around, in one part of a very small part of safety, right? But at an extreme, what people do to promote safety individually or collectively, it will be a point of tension, I think, in many of the spaces we are. But I just wanted to say that first thing out loud, because I know it's a base level. To get to the thriving that others have mentioned, right, is going to require that I feel okay walking down the street from police surveillance or from other people and neighbors where I have disputes, whatever the case might be.
Right. I mean, I think, a really basic question, a question that was raised by Alejandro's frame is, do I have a high quality neighborhood school? And a question that you raise is, do I feel safe walking to it? And those are both necessities. And I think something else that you said that's really critical, that even just your little example of how somebody carries a gun as a way of addressing the fact that they don't feel safe, and then that makes others not feel and perhaps not be safe. In my experience, every single issue we're talking about creates spirals, either downward spirals or virtuous cycles. And I mean, it's almost impossible for violence not to generate more violence. And that, I think, that observation is why the questions that this committee will be thinking about strike me as so important, because it can often feel inevitable to respond to feeling a reality of lack of safety by choosing to deploy violence, but it can be enormously difficult to do that in a way that doesn't over time create a cycle that goes in the wrong direction. Marcus.
Yeah, thanks. I just have, I think, everything. I agree with everything what's been said. It resonates with me, but I'd also add it also means being safe from racial hostility, also from whatever state sanctioned apparatus or civilian ones. That's also a big portion of safety.
Right. I mean, I think that it is very easy to set up systems where we declare an apparatus that we construct to be on the side of the angels, and then ignore the question of what harm it can do. I mean, at some level, that has a lot to do with why we're here. And I mean, you said two enormous things in a record-breakingly short amount of time. Right? One is the question of race, and one is the question of kind of state-established tools for harm. I think those are both really, really critical. Kimberly.
So I think Marcus and I were on the same wavelength, because I was going to suggest the same thing. I think that we also need to consider the structures and practices that lend itself to members of the community not feeling safe in their interactions with the police, whether it's for something as simple as, hey, can you assist me, to, not even engaging necessarily in violent crime, right? I think we really need to look at what are the practices within our policing structure, within our response from the police to the community that, make people feel safe or make them feel, in harm's way, even in the most innocent of interactions. I know a lot of people, just in terms of getting stopped for running a stop sign, can make you feel afraid for your life, right? And I don't think that everyone lives with that experience. And so how do we dismantle those structures and systems that lend itself to patterns and practices that don't make people feel safe in their day-to-day police interactions?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's why this, even just the word, much less the kind of concept and work around shared safety, is so critical. That the goal cannot be to divide our community into two chunks, even if one of those chunks is very big and one is very small, and then provide safety for one of the two parts. That we have to have a shared sense of what mutual safety is, and if the institutions that we build to provide for that are inherently unsafe for some, then we need to rethink how we're operating. So thank you for that, Kimberly. I'd like to ask Melissa Secludi, and I'm sorry to put folks on the spot, but obviously there's been some reference to police work and the police department so far, and obviously the police department is made up of close to 150 people who spend an awful lot of time thinking about the question of how to provide for safety, and also what safety is and for whom. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to just respond to that question of what, in the context of your work and the mission of the EPD, what do you mean by safety? What do we mean by safety? What does it mean to provide a sense of safety?
Thank you. Safety for me means a lot of things. I mean, I think the first thing, when I think about it as a public servant, the first thing that comes to mind is being able to provide safety and security for the community that I serve. So in this case, that's Evanston. And there's so much that comes with that, having a partnership and having a relationship that's built on trust. But I think that a lot of communities suffer here in this regard, because there has to be that unconditional respect for one another, that unconditional level of trust with one another. And none of that works unless the community and the police are working together in partnership. So as far as my job, that's what safety means. And then of course, taking it to a different level, the safety of my officers and those that work under my command, the safety of the officers that, put themselves in harm's way by doing their job and enforcing the law. There's certainly a level of safety that we need to be cognizant for the men and women that are out there doing the actual job. So that's what it means for me.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I see that Doreen Price's hand is up. So go ahead, Doreen.
Hi, thank you. Greetings to you all. I got it. I almost, I mean, I didn't intentionally become late, but being late, I got to capture all this good stuff before I started. So thank you. And Marcus and Kimberly and a few more are all talking, or the recent speaker also talk about working together, but you can't work together unless you feel connection. And Mr. Bist has talked about, Mayor Bist has talked about that we have to act as one, and we can be, you know, all different and embrace all that. And I worked in my groups, my teams happen to be the same way in the past. So I want to read something I wrote, and it really touches upon and makes it a lot quicker than me explaining it. In terms of hate, I look at hate, and when I see it, it makes me cringe. And we see hate in all the awful things that have happened, which is the absolute, the end point of hostility, because hostility can grow. And so we're talking not only about preventing hate, but intervening in the growth of hostility, which is called de-escalation. And even in city enforcement, de-escalation might be better sometimes than some other approaches, which are stressful. And so anyway, I'll read this really quick, and it's what I sent some close friends, and I call it critical peace and well-being. Hate is hazardous to health and safety, or we can talk about harassment or hostility, right? Critical peace and well-being are kind of what we want. Hate disconnected, because we're talking about connection, right? So hate disconnected, unstoppable, is violence to health and safety with dire consequences as with abuse. To enable hateful lies should be, you know, never, ever, ever condoned inside government or outside government. In terms as a code of conduct, I thought that maybe that would be good for any group or even the council to establish right now, to have the behaviors that Mayor Biss has actually expressed an interest in. Historical and recent community outrages are public health emergencies. Intervention is critical to life and well-being. Trauma intervention as well. So when we have emergencies, it's not like the trauma comes later. It starts and gets worse until we get help. To immediately disrupt and remove hate is Evanston's pandemic, it would be prevention. It would be a prevention or a cure. We must all start with our new mayor and new members of council who are working to address far too many wrongs to the same people still here, as was mentioned last week meeting, that we need to know who those people are, or no, Mayor Biss's really good public forum, the town hall that he had, and that was brought up across all the groups. So in terms of this sense of someone's finally discovering you, and you know, if you've been traumatized, you feel like no one believes you. And when somebody does believe you, you feel like you're almost liberated, but that's just one step of a long journey. So why not build a new public health center, disassembled and deprioritized the old one by 2 city managers, and would have reduced widespread burdens and scarcity of help? Why not start inclusive community building to have, which we all of you are on board and speaking about, to have public health center with personalized or integrative medicine, supporting our diversity and strength now and future generations? Shouldn't that be you and our legacy, Mayor Biss? I thought of you as I was writing this. What infrastructure change will eliminate white supremacy within Evanston's government and community? It's here. Is this not Evanston's January 6th hiding from accountability? It started again with the abrupt, disrespectful firing of Chief Cook, my personal opinion, and I don't mean to offend anyone. Why the legal advantage of shock and rush? Regarding that, I had that happen when I lost my job, so I know how traumatic that can be. And I look at him as a person who has been humble and honest and had integrity and contributed a lot to the community. So it scares me because I haven't contributed anything nearly as much as he has. Why continued support of 2 city managers right now, unless we change things and move forward with where we are, or figure out ways to make it work better?
I'm sorry
And
to
then-
interject. I really appreciate community members joining this discussions, and I want to make sure the community members are able to participate. I'd like to be flexible about that and not.
Okay.
But I think for an item like this, it's kind of a prepared statement. If we could just in the future include stuff like this in the public comment period, and then make sure that we're giving time for the flow of the conversation, I think that would be really helpful. But if you want to submit the whole statement in writing, I'd be happy to distribute it to the committee, and certainly, want to make sure we're continuing to be a welcoming place for everyone in the community to be a participant, and also to allow time for the committee members to all share their views as well on some of these difficult topics.
Thank you. No, thank you. I respect that. I have a little bit of anxiety, and so reading sometimes is better, but I understand what you're trying to do. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate you being here very, very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else from the committee who'd like to add to what's already been mentioned, or to present another point of view or attitude of any kind before I ask another question? Okay. I think we heard a lot of really useful things, and I think, just quickly trying to reflect on the variety of different comments. To me, the thread is really around the replacement of a kind of oppositional or hostile vision of what it's required to provide for safety, with an effort to communally provide the kinds of resources that change the equation around what our conversations about safety really are. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. I also think it's an important thing for us, though, to be, I think it's important for us to begin to distinguish between long-term aspirations and immediate-term aspirations. I think the kind of provision of the kinds of services and supports that, for instance, Alejandra referenced, that's the right thing for our city to aspire to. I think it's the right thing for any community to aspire to, and I think it's achievable. In fact, I think it was Evangeline who talked about the resources we have in our community, and yet the way in which they're often directed away from those who have been harmed the most, rather than toward those who have been harmed the most. That said, I think we can all acknowledge that we've got an ocean liner to turn around, and that there will be this will be a gradual process, and there will be a kind of building up over time of our ability to provide for services that right now are too scarce. And I wonder, though this is a really hard question, I recognize that, but I wonder if folks have thoughts about how to, in the context of the visions that have been articulated, how to think about some of our more medium-term goals around shared safety in Evanston.
I'll share.
Thank you, Patrick.
I think if you look at the working groups that have been created, and even some of the topics where we didn't have consensus to establish working groups around those topics. But I think if you look at many of the topics, maybe even all of them, that we debated forming working groups around, and certainly the ones that we have, it seems like the underlying question is, what role do we want law enforcement, or I should say one of the underlying questions, what role do we want law enforcement to play in our community? And can we take a more surgical, tactical, strategic approach to when we as a community engage law enforcement? And although this is a little off topic, I will say that we had a case the other day where it was a child custody case, And the judge at the end of the hearing said, okay, well, you two are, at odds with each other. When you do the handoff, the exchange of the child, go to the police department and hand off your child there. I mean, that for this judge was the appropriate role of the police station, the police department. And I think, and that's just one little example of a question. It's really an example that I throw out there in the form of a question. Is that the role? And I think Alejandra and you, Daniel, had a beautiful exchange that ultimately posed, I think, even the larger question, which is the distinction between security and safety. And I think that gets back to this question of the role. And I'm going to stop now because now I'm just rambling. But those are my thoughts.
Well, I wouldn't characterize that as rambling. In fact, I was about to jump in when you did, and was going to say something related, but less eloquent, which is, one thing that I would love is to have an agreement of what resources are needed to provide the kinds of solutions we believe in to the problem of safety. And you asked it in sort of a very similar question in a different way. You said, what are the problems for which law enforcement is a solution? And I would say that's a great question, but also for everything that's not on that list, what do we need to solve those problems in a different way that we believe in? And I think that if we can't answer that question, then we can't begin to build the infrastructure we believe in. But I think answering that question with clarity and honesty, even if it's going to take a long time to act on that answer in totality, having a clear answer that we agree on, believe in, and share is a real step forward. Sarah.
I would like to bring up, I don't know if everyone on this committee is aware, but Evanston Fight for Black Lives took months and months with outside help, putting together a comprehensive 27-page packet on what those resources could look like and what this town could look like and what is needed on that list. And we really lay out practically how we could implement this and replace many of the duties that police officers are called on to do. And I think even if you don't agree with our call for a defunding of 75%, the resources that we've come up with and the alternatives and the options are very viable. And I think as a group, we should utilize that, and I would be happy to share it.
Thank you. I'm just driving like an Open Meetings Act panic. I think for Open Meetings Act reasons, what I'll do is I'll just send that to everyone in the group. It's fine. Actually, I'm being ridiculous. I'm pretending to be a lawyer when I'm not, and no one should ever do that. Sarah, if you don't mind going ahead and sharing that with the group, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone else want to jump in on some of these questions about either reactions to anything that was said by Sarah or Patrick, or thoughts about what intermediate goals for not just this committee exclusively, but also for our community might be? Sean.
I think I'm probably just going to be repeating a lot of what other people said, but I think it's important to ask the question: what service do we need law enforcement for, and are they the best response for? And if we can remove a law enforcement response to an incident or an occurrence or a place that somebody doesn't feel safe, and have an additional response, what service might that be, or what might be the best service? And for example, I know that the alternative response to police has done a lot of work on putting together a service to address mental health situations, and to have the resources to deal with that. And I would say that one of the questions we can ask is if we're if we are removing law enforcement response from that, are we in return
Sorry, can I ask folks who are not speaking to mute themselves, just because it can be hard to hear otherwise, please?
Sorry, if we're moving a law enforcement response from that, are we in turn funding the alternative response in a way that we can ensure is being successful? When we do involve law enforcement, are we making sure that those situations are sorry, I'll back that question up, but yeah, are we making sure that the responses that we do have are being funded in a way that they are successful?
Can I call Councilmember Fleming? Would you mind speaking to that? Because Sean alluded indirectly and directly to the Alternative Emergency Response Subcommittee's work, and I was wondering if you could speak to two things that he alluded to. So I think many people can agree, if not almost everyone, that there is a really important place for professional mental health workers in responding to calls related to mental health problems. So that's the effort that your subcommittee has been working on. You made a determination to, for the collection of calls you're working on, replace police with mental health workers. So not go with kind of a co-response if a cop shows up with a mental health worker, but instead go with a mental health only response for certain types of calls. So question one, Councilmember Fleming, is can you say a word about that thought process, about how your group thought through the question of when to do co-response, when to do police only, and when to do non-police only? And then number two, to Sean's other question of the resources, what have you learned, or what should we know about what it takes to set up an alternative approach with enough tools that it's going to be successful?
Sure. So our committee, which myself and Evangeline are serving on with a cadre of other people, we looked at a bunch of other models. Some are co-responder models, some are not. We also looked at the police calls. We also talked to a lot of professionals. Also on our committee are a lot of people who work in social services of some kind. And we really just decided for Evanston, the co-responder model, we didn't think got at the crux of the issue, which is the issue of having police not responding to calls that do not require, we always say, like an armed officer. As I will say in that conversation, and she's now interim police chief Barnes and some other officers were very honest about their limitations, even when they show up to serve people, right? They're called a lot to serve people who have mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse issues. And I would say for the most part, our police don't want to arrest those folks, but they have limited tools, right? They are police officers. They are not social workers. And our city is not, we don't even have a place in the city to kind of take people aside from the hospital who are, in need of these services. So to the police's credit, we have not equipped them to do this as their job. They have been doing it because we don't have another service provider. So our thought process really was to get in another service provider. And we decided to have, that be Our goal is to have four staff, so there'll be 2 licensed clinician and 2 people with lived experience, because lived experience is really important. You know, certification or degree isn't the end all be all. So that is kind of what our goal was, under the understanding that if something is outside of this staff's purview, they can call the police and they can call fire, right? They'd be equipped with radio to do that, and understanding that service is still available to them if something happens, you know, out on the street or at a call that you can't handle. So that was the first part. And in terms of the resources, so it's been hard, right? We unfortunately were only allocated $200,000 to do this monumental work as a pilot, and $200,000 is not a lot of money. So unfortunately, we did not have anyone to respond to our RFP. I can't say that's only because of money. I think there were a couple other questions that we just didn't have a handle on. But the way the work stands now is that Alderman Ravel and I are going out to talk to a couple providers one who provides this service already and one who provides kind of a similar service, to talk to them directly to see kind of what it would take to get them to lead this work for us. And then also looking at some other monies, maybe through the rescue fund, to make sure, right, it doesn't make sense to have folks out there who are not equipped and who we also are not paying a living wage to do this work. So we do still hope to get something launched. You know, our goal was the fall. We'll see if that's, you know, maybe late fall at this point. But yeah, so it is a heavy lift. A lot of communities are talking about it. There's not a lot of communities that are, you know, there's a handful of communities doing it. A lot of them are using a co-responder model. But we just decided, for kind of the calls we have, and for what our community has asked of us, that a co-responder model was not the right model, right? We also were very cognizant of the police who are on duty. And so if we have a social worker and a police officer there, and there's something that maybe is an arrestable offense, right? The police officer want to do that. And so we don't want to put them in a situation that they are going to be not completing the duties of which we have for them right now, or where there would be tension between the social worker and the police officer regarding how a person is handled, right? So we thought best to really have just the social worker and the peer support person on the scene, and then they could, you know, assess and treat people. The last thing I will say is, even in that model, if we get this kind of program up and working, the other big thing is, where are we taking people so they can receive support, right? We know, you know, whether it's police or fire, whoever, we take a lot of people to the emergency rooms, and the emergency room says, hey, this isn't a medical emergency, this is beyond what we can do here, and people are back out, you know, within a matter of hours. And so we kind of have this revolving door where we are not really, as a city, equipped, or we at this point don't have a lot of supports for people, particularly in the after hours time, that our staff or any staff can really kind of take people to get the support that they need. So that is a greater problem that I think our committee will start to try to work through. But what involves a lot more money and a lot more coordination of services that we don't currently have really after 5 o'clock.
Great, thank you. I mean, thanks for all that. It's super important stuff. I just think we need to take really seriously the lesson that yes, everything will happen gradually. You bet. Things, you know, it's difficult for government to have enormously abrupt change. That said, if we're trying to set something up, we can't start so small that we don't have the tools to do something that works. And so I think as we contemplate recommendations, I think we're going to have to make sure that we're building out the resources that are actually needed to tackle the problems that we're trying to address, and that will not necessarily be inexpensive. It's not clear that it would be. So it's 1:15 now, and so I want to, unless anyone has any last burning things to say on the topics we've discussed so far. Okay, sure. I want to transition to the next topic. So I sent an email to everyone with the membership in the working groups. Did anybody not receive that email describing who's in which of the working groups? Okay, excellent. So just a few things about that. some of which I'll repeat from the email, some of which are perhaps new. So the three groups are, again, the one is kind of rethinking the organizational structure, but what would it look like if we built a department from scratch, and how might our answers to that influence the search for a new chief? That group will be chaired by Councilmember Burns. There's the Violence Prevention and Violence Interruption Strategies group chaired by Andy Papachristos. And then there's the Breaking Down Data Regarding Patrol and Allocation of Time, with a focus on traffic and pedestrian enforcement. And that group will be chaired by me. Again, by chair, I'm not talking about someone kind of exerting strong editorial influence. I'm talking about somebody making sure the groups meet regularly and have coherent agendas and a good work plan. So, for those of you who did not, for the many of you who didn't ask to be to be chairs, I'm glad that message got across. It's not, your voice will be equally influential, but I thought to create a working group without a chair is a recipe for a lot of things not happening. I think it's pretty important for these groups to meet once between each of our meetings. So my intent will be to get my group together before the meeting that we're going to have 2 weeks from today on July 6th. I hope the other two could do that as well. Obviously, this is, the first meeting, so maybe it'll have to schedules might require it to wait until after July 6th. But I think in general, it's going to be important for us to meet, have a rhythm of every 2 weeks, the full committee meets. Between those meetings, each of these three groups has a real discussion and make some progress. And then we come back as a group and kind of hear about the progress that one or more of those groups have made. I've gotten several requests. I mentioned in the email that one member, Kimberly, kind of explicitly asked to be on two groups. She just sort of felt equally compelled by both. And I, of course, said, sure. I've gotten emails from others who've said, wow, all these are pretty interesting to me. And I would say, great. I personally would like to participate if only, even if only as a fly on the wall in as many of these meetings as possible. And, for those of you who want to be a part of all these groups, that's awesome. I'm just trying to be cognizant of the relatively significant demands that we're placing on folks' time, and certainly wouldn't expect that anyone to do that. I think that I do not think it's necessary for these groups to take votes or to have official power of any kind. So I don't think it's necessary for us to create official groups. That said, in the interest of transparency, I don't think it's a great idea for these groups to meet in secret. And frankly, even just in compliance with the Open Meetings Act for our whole committee, it's safer for these groups not to meet in secret. So I'm happy to leave the kind of scheduling to the chairs, whether you want to just kind of survey folks or, pick a time or how you want to do it. But I would ask that everyone communicates with me and Shanika in advance so that we can give proper public notice, because I do think it would really send the wrong signal to the community if we treat these working group meetings as kind of opportunities to do things in secret without visibility from the public. Okay, so I just dumped a ton of logistical stuff on people's heads. Was everything I said clear? Were there questions about any of the sort of logistics or practical things that I went through? Or frankly, does anyone have a different opinion about anything that I just said?
So can I ask us some clarifying questions?
Please.
When so obviously communicating with you and Shanika about those things, do we also have to use Evanston Zoom invitations and make it open to public? Just so I'm a rule.
I think it's better if we do. I
Okay.
think it's preferable if we do. And again, I don't think most of the Open Meetings Act is relevant. I don't think we're going to take lots of votes that need to be noticed on the agenda in advance. I don't think that's the point here, but I do think it's important to let the public have access. And so, hopefully that's both good for transparency and for your workload, because you can sort of offload to us the issue of sending out the invite, making the Zoom link, and hopefully even producing minutes as well. Kimberly's got a hand up, but Andy, was that your only question, or did you have?
Yeah, and I apologize for not raising my hand.
Oh, it's fine. you introduced that as several questions and it felt like only one. So I wanted to make sure you were done before calling on somebody else. Kimberly.
Hey, I just have one question. I missed the last meeting, so maybe you covered this, but as we break into the working group, should we be keeping in mind any sort of like milestones or dates from a timeline perspective as far as how the individual groups will sort of inform our larger, I guess, deliverable or, you know, sort of recommendation and the timing that you laid out in our first meeting around that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer, unfortunately, is kind of complicated. So to the extent that the outcome of the group's work will involve recommendations for the 2022 budget, I think keeping us informed about where you're going pretty early is important, and really having final recommendations by the end of September at the latest is critical. So that's one category of deadline. To the extent that so that's like, if you're proposing an ongoing shift in allocation of resources for the city, that would be probably where you'd want to go. A different thing you might propose is to say, hey, we may not be ready to propose an ongoing shift in allocation of resources, but here's a thing that we want to try that we need resources for. That might just be a one-time request for funding. Well, that would best really fit into the American Rescue Plan Act funding, which is a one-time significant cash infusion from the federal government. And the good news from your standpoint, but the bad news from an accountability and deadline standpoint, is that's kind of a rolling process. That's a $43 million pot of money that's been given to us by the federal government, but no one's going to decide to spend all of that at once. And so I would say for things like that, it's more of a rolling thing. But you know, right now we're in the phase of really kind of accepting ideas and brainstorming and you know, shaping where those resources go. And I would guess that by the time we hit that same kind of deadline of, you know, the beginning of the fall, it's going to be in a different period where it'll have taken shape and the kind of categories will have been worked out and the amounts of money that's going to go to each of those categories will have been worked out, and it'll be harder to have a sort of structural impact on how those resources are deployed. So so that's much less of a hard deadline, but it's really kind of practically speaking a similar deadline. And then I would say if a group comes to a conclusion that you know, that's just too fast. It's too fast. We're not, you know, if we meet that deadline, we're sacrificing quality and public input for speed. And so we're willing to forego the opportunity, for instance, participating in the 2022 budget process. I would say great, but I also think in the interest of giving us, you know, the ability to evaluate, assess, and then potentially change direction or keep going, I would like by the end of the year to have outcomes back from the working groups, even if those sort of externally imposed deadlines turn out not to be the ones that we're listening to. Does that make sense, Kimberly?
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. We have Patrick and Shanika. I think Shanika's hand was up first, actually. So Shanika?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, for the 3 groups that are broken down here, whenever you all plan in your meetings, please let me know as soon as possible. And in order for me to even tackle separate meetings along with this big one, I also have other committees that I staff. So I do want to make sure that I don't run into any scheduling conflicts. I don't see any of like other internal staff, such as like Secludity or anyone. I'm not trying to put more work on you, but if any of you who are internal staff who do have Zoom access and willing to staff one of these subgroups, that's fine too. Just we can coordinate separately, whoever that main person is, so we can get whatever data information we need to report back out. But I just wanted to throw that out there in case you all are starting the scheduling And if I can't make them, I just want to make sure that we have some backups to some people who can, just scheduling purposes. So.
And I want to be clear. I mean, I think it is not a realistic expectation of you that you be staffing all of these meetings. And again, I think for purposes of the value of transparency, I think it's important for them to be open. But I don't see these being conducted in the traditional, like a traditional public meeting with votes and so forth. And so, from where I stand, we could be very, very flexible in terms of who is physically on the meeting during the course of the time that's been carved out for it.
Yeah, most definitely. And I agree with it being open and transparent as well. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page of how we run the meeting, and whatever help we need for it, we can definitely try to accommodate internally. I just wanted to make sure that we're all sending the same information at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you. Patrick.
Quick request, when the committees are scheduled, and I don't know who will be the holder of the 3 working group schedules, if the full working group could be notified as to when those are, just so as if we are interested in attending, or if we have staff members or colleagues that would like to participate, that'd be great. All right, so you're shaking your head, so I'll take that as a yes.
And let me interject, and just without dictating, I would, for everybody's simplicity and convenience, I would urge folks to establish a regular schedule.
Sure.
I'll certainly do everything I can to make that work for the working group I'm chairing, and then we'll just share that.
Yep.
You make a great point, Patrick, that I'm sure others have thought of, but for those of you on this call who represent organizations,
right,
even if 4 different hour-long meetings every 2 weeks is too much for you personally, please feel free to send somebody you work with. I think that would be really constructive. Sorry, second question.
And the second question, and I'm trying really hard not to be the adult, to be the opposite of the kid I was as an adult, because I realize there's 2 minutes left and I don't want to say, teacher, hey, I got a question, and lead us over. But Daniel, have you given any further thought regarding the community engagement work that we had talked about? Because I remember there was somewhat of a divide in the committee between those who said, well, we really need to find shared safety and we need community input to have a definition. And then there were others who were like, oh my God, let's not over process because that's so Evanston, let's just get to the work. And I think you tried to kind of reach a middle ground. And so have you given any thought to what that could look like or should look like?
So
in 2 minutes.
Right, I promised myself we were going to get out of here at 5 because I promised that the last 2 times and we didn't. So let me say this. This question has been on my mind. I would ask everyone's indulgence to put this at the top of our agenda to really discuss in the meeting 2 weeks from now. And I would ask if any of you have any thoughts. They don't need to be global thoughts. It doesn't need to be a grand philosophy. It can be, hey, the Moran Center would love to host a roundtable. Could we do that? So if any of you have any ideas, requests, or suggestions regarding public input, I would love to hear them in writing between now and the next meeting. And then we'll put that at the top of the agenda, and I'll, anything that you share with me, with your okay, I'll distribute to the whole group for consideration in advance of that, because I do think it's a critical question, and I appreciate, Patrick, notwithstanding the time of day that you brought it up, I appreciate you not allowing us to let that go, because I know that sometimes good intentions don't get you very far if you don't really put the item on the front burner, especially with something like this that is difficult. So thank you for that, and more to come for sure. So with that, it's 5 o'clock. Thank you very much. We'll all be in touch about scheduling working group meetings, and our next meeting is on July 6th, which is Tuesday, 2 weeks from today at 4 p.m. And seeing nothing else on our agenda, the Reimagining Public Safety